This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. If you follow the news from South America, maybe you've heard about Colombia's terrible civil wars, drug gangs, rebel armies, and at long last, a political settlement. Or the aftermath of Venezuela's most recent election, with what looks like a simply fictional election result, and Maduro holding on to power in a country with a cratering economy. Now there's also Ecuador, an OPEC member, an affordable retirement haven for many North Americans that uses the US dollar as its currency. Ecuador is notably absent from the radar of most Americans, but that may be changing. To get us up to speed on President Noboa's predicament, we turn things back to producer Mateo Schimpf.
Ecuador's president, Daniel Noboa, is scraping together every last dollar to fight his war against the country's gangs. But the massive spike in violence, it still doesn't feel real to many Ecuadorians.
We were like an island of peace.
Jorge Imbaquingo covers politics at El Diario del Comercio,
which is the most important newspaper here in Ecuador.
I called up Jorge because I wanted to know how Ecuador went from an island of peace to the center of Latin America's bloodiest drug war.
It's a very long story, but let me tell you how this happened. Ecuador has a new constitution in the year 2008.
Leftist President Rafael Correa ushered in the country's new constitution, and it radically changed Ecuador's social and political landscape. It nearly halved the poverty rate through increased government spending on things like infrastructure, education, and healthcare. It also granted Correa with greater control over Ecuador's central bank and army, and the option to run for at least 2 more terms. But importantly, and according to Jorge, controversially, it introduced a universal citizenship law.
So we were allowed to permit people from other countries to come to Ecuador with no visa. It was revolutionary for that government to say, we don't need a visa for foreigners.
It was part of President Correa's progressive immigration agenda, essentially saying that citizenship shouldn't be defined by political borders. But according to Jorge, that had some unintended consequences.
In those people, there were criminals from other countries like Mexico, Colombia, and Peru, people from Albania and Italy.
Ecuador, just by virtue of geography, is a pretty attractive place for drug traffickers. It's sandwiched right between 2 of the world's largest cocaine producers, Colombia and Peru, and has 8 major shipping ports along its coast. When Ecuador relaxed its visa process and started building new roads in rural parts of the country, it became a low-barrier market for international cocaine suppliers.
So we had this problem in the year 2008. The next year, we have another moment because a U.S. military base in Ecuador, in the city of Manta, we just said that they were not allowed to be here anymore. And they were making a good war of drugs here in Ecuador.
President Correa basically struck a deal with the narcos. He would expel an anti-narcotics base on Ecuador's coast in exchange for peace between gangs trafficking cocaine inside the country. And for the most part, it worked. Other than a spat between Mexico's famously powerful Sinaloa and Nueva Generación cartels in 2013, things stayed pretty quiet.
But what happened in the year 2019, Nueva Generación wanted to take the control, and that was totally war. That was hell in Ecuador.
Under intense political pressure stemming from bribery and corruption charges, President Correa fled to Belgium, where, by the way, he's still in exile. His departure created a massive political vacuum, while Ecuador's economy was simultaneously collapsing under strict austerity measures. Without a buffer between the cartels and a booming demand for cocaine in Europe, the island of peace was suddenly caught in the middle of a Category 5 hurricane.
From the year 2020 to the year 2023, there were 500 inmates killed. And that was when we understood what was happening in Ecuador. We have to think not just about us, but our security, which is difficult to understand for other people from other countries, because you have to face your life.
Estamos al aire para que sepa que la mafia que no.
By now, you might have seen the videos of masked men storming a TV station in Quito. It's a surreal scene where guys carrying guns take reporters and producers hostage. On live TV. The whole chaotic episode unfolded earlier this year in January, just 6 weeks into Daniel Noboa's presidency. And it felt a bit like the Mexican, Colombian, Albanian gangs were taunting the young president. On the campaign trail last year, President Noboa had a decidedly tough-on-crime message. He was going to build more prisons and fill them up with the narcos terrorizing the country. He even showed up to his final debate performance in a bulletproof vest. But so far, his military campaign against Ecuador's gangs, 22 of which are now listed as terrorist organizations, has come with mixed results. In June, a morgue in Guayaquil, that's a coastal city in Ecuador and essentially ground zero for drug trafficking, it couldn't fit any more bodies in its refrigeration unit after violence broke out between rival gangs. With a presidential election looming next February, President Noboa continues to ramp up military raids on the country's gangs. The president is on a mission to convince Ecuadorians that he's making inroads with the narcos.
There was here in Ecuador this important journalist from the New Yorker, Jon Lee Anderson. I think that president wanted to have a little bit of publicity, but it was a wrong movement to me.
Jon Lee Anderson has been writing about Ecuador for The New Yorker and interviewed, you could even say embedded with, its recently elected president, and he joins us now. Jon Lee Anderson, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
You've written about a lot of places and about a lot of leaders. Why Ecuador and why now?
Well, that's a really good question. We live at a time where you're seeing authoritarian populism rise up here and there. There's characters that become almost household names like Javier Milei and Nayib Bukele, kind of Trumpian figures. And you have, of course, the left. We've seen what happened with Maduro and the Venezuelan election, this kind of repeated cycles of despotism that somehow the region has not gotten rid of, and I include the United States in that. But Daniel Noboa represented something new. What's happened in Little Ecuador over the past year. And when I say Little Ecuador, I mean it is a smallish Andean state between Colombia and Peru. And it's long been regarded as a kind of quiet place. There's the pretty Andean hills, and there's about 10,000 or so American pensioners who live there. And then suddenly last year, there was a series of spectacular violent incidents that brought our attention to Ecuador, which began with the assassination in public of a presidential candidate just before the election. In that election, the country's banana tycoon's son, who was not previously known as a political figure, in fact, he was just been only a couple of years a parliamentarian, ended up winning the election. And it's an election in which, for a lot of complicated reasons, essentially whoever won was going to finish the term of an unpopular former president who resigned. So about a year and a half in office. And once he came to power, he showed a willingness to become a kind of law and order president and immediately began launching raids. He unleashed the military in the country, changed the law so that the military could operate and go after the cartels who had murdered the presidential candidate that was his rival. And in a series of incidents that followed that, each one more gothic than the last, essentially Ecuador's Pablo Escobar, doing time in a maximum security, as well as another, escaped from their prison cells, i.e. with the help of authorities. And this all created a situation in which Ecuador went from being one of the safest countries in Latin America to being one of the most dangerous, if not the most dangerous, with armed raids and bodies and the cartels fighting back with bombs and murders and kidnappings. And Daniel Noboa became increasingly vocal about his willingness to fight them. And so he became a figure of great interest to me because he was breaking the mold of what we saw. It was unclear as well whether he was a Bukele or a Milei or what sort of side of the political spectrum he fell upon. And so I traveled to Ecuador to meet with him, and lo and behold, much to my surprise, found myself with him essentially from day one. And he included me in pretty much all of his activities for the next several weeks.
Well, that was the striking part. I mean, obviously, he was comfortable having you basically tail him through the country. And it's quite clear from the piece as well that you had a fair amount of one-on-one time. Why do you think the president allowed you that level of access?
He's an unusual guy. In a way, he seems more American than he does Latin American in a sense. He was born in Miami. He is Ecuadorian, of Ecuadorian parents, but he was raised at a German school in Ecuador and then spent 6 months every year in New York. I said, where in New York? He said, the Hamptons. He's from the Hamptons. And, we would talk about skiing and he would say, the powder in Aspen's good this year. He's a 1%er and that's his world. And I think he felt he knew what the New Yorker was. I'd never found out if he'd read me before, but it's as if you met a guy at a party with a certain crowd in New York and started hanging out. It was like that. He took me on the presidential plane with him and once his wife, and who's very young, he's 36, she's 26, social influencer, and their babies came along and we went to the beach. But a lot of plane trips with him in which he'd sit with me and we'd talk. He has a very forensic level of attention and interest on a range of topics. If you ask him, God forbid, about the banana crop, let's say, or for that matter, money laundering, you'll get a 35-minute forensic disquisition on it. He's unusual. He's socially a little awkward. He's not immediately, obviously empathetic, but has 3 masters from the United States in everything from public policy to musical theory with economics in the middle. And he's met most of the kind of people that are in the news. At one point or another, of course, he'd met Trump at some party in New York. I once asked him whom he felt most akin to, whom he felt most comfortable with amongst the Latin American leaders. And to my shock and surprise, he said, Lula. He said, yeah, I met him. I said, well, when did you meet Lula? And he told me the year, and it would have been when he was about 20 at some father and son's leadership summit in Mexico City organized by the Mexican billionaire Carlos Slim. I said, what is it about Lula you like? He says, I've always admired the way he operates politically. He's a canny player. So we ended up having quite a few conversations about power because he was very aware that he now exercised power. And that was something he was interested in exploring and talking about, which is something I always try to get to with leaders. They don't really want to talk about the very essential thing that makes them different to the rest of us. But I could see that Daniel Noboa had it very much on his mind.
Well, appropriately so, it would seem, in the case of Ecuador, because he has taken on for himself unprecedented powers by declaring a state of internal conflict. He's now in control of the country's security apparatus and doing what he can to tamp down what, as you referred to it, the Gothic levels of violence in Ecuador. How's he doing? How's that going?
Jury's still out. Depending on who you speak to, there's a lot of cynics out there, and they say it doesn't matter who he gets. The cartels are still going to be running the country. Essentially, what happened was under the pressure in neighboring Colombia, which of course is the world's greatest producer of cocaine and has long been an epicenter of global narco trafficking, under the pressure from the DEA and government there, the cartels simply moved south to neighboring Ecuador. They had already compromised a lot of the upper Amazon and the area where the geographical borders of the two countries. And then Ecuador really modernized the country's road system. So it means that you can get your product to the seaports. And Ecuador has 6, including the second biggest port in all of Latin America, very, very quickly and without the oversight in Colombia. And so it was also a country, because there was not the same oversight, everybody from police to customs officials to judges to prison authorities were much more subordinable. And so that's apparently what happened over the past 15 or so years, is that this country has effectively become co-opted in many of its state institutions by the cartels. And that was what became quite clear over the past year in the drug war, right down to the cartel leaders essentially being let out of prison. The other thing that has to be said, I'm talking about Noboa here, is that he, in fact, is the only current Latin American leader who is openly going to war with the cartels. If you look at neighboring Colombia, Bolivia, Peru, or you go up to Mexico, yes, you have security forces. They do things, but in fact, none of them are in a state of declared war. And that is the difference. The last time we saw this anywhere was when Pablo Escobar went to war with the state in Colombia, and thousands were killed back in the 80s and 90s. So he's really taken it upon himself, and it's difficult to know how far he can go. He's trying to change the laws. Some say that he's just power hungry and looking to be reelected, which is going to happen early next year, the next elections. He does have the U.S. behind him. He has come out on the side of the West, generally speaking, as opposed to, say, the authoritarian left. He's certainly not a pal of Maduro's. But when it comes to law and order, he's all in, and therefore earns comparisons with Bukele of El Salvador, who famously has, thrown 100,000 people into these new supermax prisons. And Noboa is all about building new prisons. It's not clear how deep and substantive or how successful he will be. Just to make it, not to find a point on this, he allowed me to sit in on an intelligence meeting, which I was surprised at. The defense minister, the interior minister, the head of their CIA and others were giving briefings about the situation. And one admiral, in fact, stood up and expressed his discomfiture with the proposal to move some heavy-duty bad guys from this one province to the country's maximum security prison called The Rock, La Roca. And he got serious pushback from the interior minister, who's a close ally of Noboa. And then he himself said, they're going there. They're going there. Afterwards, I sat down with Noboa and I said, it seemed to me that you were calling out this admiral and you're questioning his loyalties. And he said, yeah, I am questioning him. I don't know who got to him, but it could be that he's in their pay. He was that open about people in his own security administration. That's how tenuous it feels there.
It's not unusual for the scion of one of the nation's richest families to become a Latin American president. But he's a complete newcomer. It's not like he was aiming his life toward this mission. As you mentioned, 36 years old, young, handsome, arguably, I'm sure, to some people in Ecuador, not even Ecuadorian. He was hardly crafted from central casting for this job of being the guy who takes on the international narcotics gangs. Did he have a sense of mission? Did he impress you as someone who's sort of fired up with a kind of zeal that's a result of the life he's lived?
Yes. First of all, I stress his age because, okay, 36 is not young, but it's young. He's young. And he is still evolving, is what I feel. He grew up with everything, although I gather his dad was fairly tough on him. The summers in the Hamptons also involved all kinds of summer classes that he had to attend. There's an element at which you feel something of a dysmorphia in the family, maybe some kind of issues with his dad, who, by the way, ran for president 5 times and lost. So he comes from a family that tends to view the country as the command class does. I was very aware of it flying in the presidential jet with him over the Andes and on helicopters. And the way he would talk about climate change or the rivers or the jungle or the deforestation. And you could see whether through the privileged upbringing he's had and a combination of his also very privileged university education, he tends to look at the country and at the world through this prism where you're on a cloud looking down. He could talk about the economy in a way I was way beyond my ken. And he had a forensic understanding of how certain institutions had become subject to the cartels. For instance, you get a government contract to build a road or a bridge. Well, the cartel comes to you and says, okay, we're going to do it. Therefore, the municipality from that moment on begins working for the cartel. And that's what's happened all over Ecuador. So it's become suffused with the state. And yes, it's as if he's found his raison d'etre. He's found his métier. He had the command class understanding of the country before, rightly or wrongly, and now he has power to change it. What he didn't have before was the security force deployment at his beck and call. And now he does. And you feel it wherever you go. You get out of the armored SUVs with him, their equivalent of the Beast. And there is this huge retinue of security guys, including snipers, including an Israeli guy, big guys that cover his entry and exit from any vehicle with bulletproof sort of aprons, big ones. And you're very aware, therefore, of his vulnerability and therefore the fragility of the state, because you're always aware of these guns and people preventing him from being killed. In fact, in our first conversation, he said that the first time he made this public, he told me that his security forces had just killed, I think, 4 of a Colombian hit team that had come across the border to kill him. I then spoke with a certain ambassador in the country, and he was shocked that he'd told me that because he was aware that it was true, but the president shouldn't have made it public anyway. There you go. I do think he enjoys power. One day he got on the jet and he was carrying Stefan Zweig's biography, Fauché, of Napoleon's head of police. And I said, what else are you reading? He said, well, when I finish Fauché, I'll go back to my favorite, which is Sun Tzu, Art of War, and Marcus Aurelius's Dialogues. So I felt like he wanted me to know that he was a student of power, and he was trying to figure out how to essentially ramp up his ability to amass and deploy power now that he had it. And in a place like Ecuador, you're very aware that he has, God, once you're in that seat, you really have power. You have armies, you have police forces, you can do pretty much whatever you want. And he's a little bit lonely, I would say. You know, the loneliness of power is a cliche, but he's young. He spent a lot of his time out of the country. Now that he's there, he does have friends. He's named some of them to places in his cabinet. You get the impression of a guy with a small social circle, and they are the people around him.
A young and handsome scourge of the cartels, that's drawn comparisons to Nayib Bukele in El Salvador. Now, obviously, El Salvador is a much smaller country, but Bukele has gotten a lot of attention by basically crushing the eye-watering murder rate in El Salvador and just jailing a lot of people without trial and so on. It turns out President Noboa doesn't like that comparison. Why not?
Again, I think he wants to be known for himself, for some kind of original thought and action. But I did press him on Bukele. And the first time I talked to him about Bukele, he sort of ducked the whole security question. When I came back to him about it, I says, you know, everybody makes the comparison between you and Bukele. On the security issue, let's forget the economics. So what do you think? And he said, well, the numbers work. It's working. He talks about the numbers. And he did with regards to Bukele. Now, he also insulted Bukele in conversation with me. You know, he regarded him and his family as corrupt, essentially trying to squeeze the country and become one of the new oligarchies. But when he spoke to me about other leaders, Noboa tended to be quite free, which was really, I have to say, very refreshing, because you don't often get that from leaders. They'll sometimes tell you something off the record or with their eyes. I remember asking AMLO about Trump while he was still running for president, and he just raised his eyebrows like this, as if to say, the guy's crazy, but he wouldn't say it in so many words.
You quote him at several junctures as sort of being cavalier about the constant question in insecure states. And it's not that unusual to hear politicians, even ones who've come to their office by democratic election, express the idea that people crave security, stability, and safety over democracy and freedom. This sort of dismissive wave toward electoral democracy when you feel your life is in danger. Did that bug you? Did it seem like you could come back to Ecuador's prelapsarian state, you might say, that you could put the genie back in the bottle? Or are we really watching something change incontrovertibly here?
I think the inclination here is towards more autocracy. He even said, if you took a poll today, most Latin Americans would go for dictatorship, because what they want, they're not getting, which is effective rule of law and safety, employment, that kind of thing. And it's true. And in his own country, it's true. And he claims to be fighting against that. He says, in fact, one day he actually surprised me by saying, I'm not a security president. I'm an employment president. He wants to create jobs for young Ecuadorians who are leaving in the droves, taking that terrible journey through the Darien Gap. But I think the possibility there, and if I had to call it, I would say, let's look at more authoritarianism going forward here. That's my hunch. But he is receptive enough, unusually so, to adjust midstream, to hear advice if it comes from the right people. It really depends on what happens in the country. If, God forbid, there should be an upsurge in killings or of a certain type of atrocity, it could really alter the way he behaves.
Given the absolutely relentless hunger for illicit drugs in the nostrils, the lungs and bloodstreams of users around the world, can a guy like Daniel Noboa imprison his way, try his way, kill his way to ridding the state of just an incredibly powerful and wealthy force like this? I don't know if he can look to any other example and say, we'll do what they did, because there's just so much money to bribe judges and police chiefs and soldiers and on and on and on, that it's hard to know how you extract it from the state if Americans won't stop snorting cocaine.
Yeah, it's true. And now Europeans too. Apparently the big market is in Europe now. Whether that means Americans are snorting less cocaine or not, I don't know. But about 60% of Colombia's cocaine, which mostly supplies now the European market, in my understanding, it goes through Ecuador. It's difficult, I would say, but not impossible if rule of law can be imposed. There are countries where it's impossible to bribe police. That means that it's possible to create a rule of law that's effective, even in countries where you have this kind of issue, like in Mexico. But it really depends on the political culture that is created there. At the moment, I would say that Ecuador is hanging in the balance between a state that is more dictatorial and autocratic in order to get things done, and one that is notionally democratic, where you still have electoral musical chairs. But in answer to that, the best thing I can say is to sort of echo what Noboa said, which was he's not anti-American because he sort of is American, but he really felt frustrated that the U.S. could not see the wood for the trees. And he kept repeating how 20% or something like that of illegal immigration to the United States, he claimed, was coming from Ecuador. And he was doing the numbers again. And he said, if only they would give us X number of billions of dollars, we could deal with it here. And they need to secure our border with Colombia. They need to do this. The U.S. needs to come here and do that. Instead, I got 30 million and change. And so he's frustrated in that way. But you look at a world where you have a Donald Trump gunning for office in the United States. We have our own duel taking place between democracy and despotism. We have a military duel showdown in Europe between whether the world's going to be democratic or authoritarian. And so Ecuador gets lost in the shuffle. And that's where his frustration is. Let's see how well he does.
Jon Lee Anderson's recent piece in The New Yorker, Ecuador's Risky War on Narcos. I recommend it to you. Thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Thanks a lot.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced, mixed, and mastered by Mateo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Spord is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.